I think obviously if one is the public sector with certain resources, one can allocate those in an affirmative way, in a targeted way. And certain areas, stroke communities, wards, whatever it is, can get a much greater allocation to assist the processes, more facilitators. Middle-class communities can pay for their own facilitators. Perhaps poorer communities get it paid for out of the public purse. I mean, I think, but to almost consciously encourage demotion of I think I would have just it's so important for democracy to encourage all communities to mobilize, even if there's sometimes a reactionary agenda.
Talking to the ward councillors and the Philippine Development Forum people is that they're very aware of their shortcomings in their engagement. So, the question around mobilization is what is the content around which people are mobilized? Because I think in the past when people were mobilized politically, the agenda was quite clear. But I think that the content of what they mobilize around is not something they can access very easily. So if you can provide a reasonable menu, the kind of idea that Edgar was talking about, that you have a finite set of resources, but you have some say around how that actually gets deployed, and that the facilitation, the actual building of those communities actually will need to be supported. Because, I think whereas in the apartheid days, there was a common kind of enemy against which everybody mobilized, and the kind of rules and the paths were very clear. That's not... there's not such a compelling force any longer. I think people are kind of shooting in different directions. But interestingly, David was with me at a community meeting in Philippi last week or the week before, where, there were probably about 40 or 50 leaders across different sectors, including the ward councillors, including the Philippine Development Forum. And they were actually standing up and saying, we need to organize at the level of street committees, at the level of blocks. We want actually to have some training around leadership, around democracy, around governance. We want to be able to make our own decisions. We want to provide the kinds of facilities that will take the youth off the street and provide opportunity. There's a severe lack of opportunity. There's a severe lack of facilities. So how do we get this going? Where do we start? Who do we turn to?
I think that issue of technical capacity, and how does one enable communities that in fact have very little technical capacity within the community to begin to access it, in order that there can be a much more meaningful engagement with the city, etc. And in the 80s, we had the sort of NGOs and the urban sector network and so on, who were really playing that role. That level is just gone, and I suppose the assumption was government somehow is now going to come in, and now government represents everybody, and therefore that gap will be closed. And the one thing we know is that there's still a very epic gap.
Part of why our middle class, predominantly white suburbs look as well as they do is because the municipality is still geared to the fact that if a councillor from that neighborhood sees a problem, a broken bin or whatever, or he gets a phone call, he'll access the bureaucracy the next day and it will be fixed within hours and days. That's inconceivable in a township or in an informal settlement, even if a ward councillor is diligent and responsive and so on. So my sort of concern with that is that there's almost a political cultural precondition that has to happen, and for me that is sort of this big issue about how do we get the middle class to, at a very personal level, experience the other Cape Town, the excluded Cape Town, the poor Cape Town. And unless we have a dovetailing of the kind of social mobilization that protects the vested interests of white ratepayers or middle class ratepayers, alongside an ability to extend the welfare kind of organizations that those same constituencies are, they donate, or they're part of a Rotary thing, or they're part of a religious organization and so on. Unless we have a way of getting those social institutions who reproduce social capital in the middle class to interact directly in townships and poor neighborhoods, I don't think we're going to have the shift in personal attitude that can create the right kind of democratic energy.
Who generates bridging networks? Where does that come from? And if that's lacking, and I do think it is lacking, and it's lacking because of our historical circumstances, probably more than in other cities who have less divisions and less divides and less inequalities and things like that. and are able to form those bridging networks through other cultural or religious institutions. We don't have that.
In some respects, the conversation started around this issue of failure. And that intrigues me because the first thing that came to mind is, how does one describe or define failure? Particularly in a context where I think it's important to be innovative and open to risk and open to opportunities. And when you have a culture where you're always trying to pursue certainty and you don't allow for yourself to make mistakes and to explore ideas, then that actually cuts off the debate before it even starts. And I think that's what you find with government officials, where it's a fantastic idea, but they're struggling to measure the amount of risk related to this thing. Will it work? Will it not? And we need to start developing more of a culture around innovation, but also asking where are appropriate sites of innovation. You know, in some respects, I enjoy this conversation, but I also find a part of me very cynical about the idea of getting all the white kids to go to the township and play soccer together and we'll solve our problems. Maybe sites of innovation and sites of action are not only in townships, but we should be thinking about how do we densify suburban areas, you know? How do we engage with behavioral change? So on the one hand, you can incentivize development, but maybe you should disincentivize parts of the city where apparently if you have a plot that's less than 1,000 square meters, your plan won't get approved. Maybe we should begin to be building very specific taxes around size of plots and so on, which can begin to make encouraging gestures, because the children can interact, but it's the ratepayers and that generation that almost need to be incentivized to make behavioral change. And a crude example is, you know, you look at London and how they dealt with congestion issues. You know, how do you stop cars from coming in? They had to make some clear decisions about taxes and those type of instruments. And I think you need the bridging networks, but I don't think it's enough to have that. And I think we need to see the city as the problem, not the townships as the problem.
No, it's very much part of the Cape Town culture, and it's how we plan, and it's so very different, I find, to a more Joburg culture, which is much more, you have an idea, let's go and do it, and if it's a mess, we'll sort it out, and maybe our strapline should become embracing failure or something like that.
What politicians and the political sort of institutions regard as, you know, sort of the perception of failure or vulnerability is very closely tied to how these issues are framed in the public debates. And the media is really essential. No, exactly.
I was amazed to hear the voices of Joe's local residents saying, we're prepared to consider medium density.
Yeah.
You know, that's amazing.
Exactly. No, the only story that is being told is, you know, the confirmation of all of our suspicions or of what's wrong with our political system and our institutions. And that's the only story the media wants to tell. So, I mean, so there's something quite fundamental, I think, about how we...
I mean, in a sense, I agree with you.
Yeah. No, but how do we shift that? I suppose that's the question, is how do we get the media in a way to have a mindset change about, you know, sort of how to narrate the Cape Town story with a different set of parameters.
But it's going back to, do you punish failure, do you reward success, and what's the balance there? And I think that, I mean, what we're really struggling with is, in a sense, in the last 10 years, people in government realized that they needed to try and build accountability, because that was slipping quite badly. And it tended to be the National Treasury approach, because it was about finance. So if you can get people to account around finance and budgeting, then that's the starting point. So you bring in the PFMA and the MFMA, which drastically punishes any little deviation in terms of procurement or not a balanced budget or any over expenditure. And then the political game now is to catch your opponents out for not doing it according to the letter of the law. And then the media buys into that, and depending on which side they support on a particular issue. So everyone is petrified of failure, because it's defined in very narrow terms.
I think the demands for clean audits, the demands that we're a competitive city, that we're a globally competitive city, that we're an investor-friendly city. Well, maybe that's the kind of the competitive, the globally, you know, that language, the zero, the clean audits, the clean governance, the e-governance, is a very kind of first world model of government, and I'm not sure how relevant it really is. But Cape Town, and again, I can only speak from, is Cape Town's government is obsessed with this e-governance and all this stuff, which is good on the one hand, but that's fine if you're one of the 5% of the population who actually have access to, and in fact, if you don't have access to wireless, then it's rather pointless having access to internet because it's so slow, at home as a real tool. So I think that, and it comes back to the media. The media sit in meetings, and they're the only external parties that can comment on the nature of discourse within government, and they don't. They're fairly junior journalists, and they write, I suppose they try and be professional, and they write factual articles. But no one's sitting there and watching the discourse and monitoring it and commenting on the discourse, which we can in the city because all the meetings are open. And it's phenomenal what people get away with in terms of in the committee that I have to report to, complete willful ignorance of what is going down in 80% of the communities. Wanting to regulate walls and regulate pets and regulate light pollution and sea points. I mean, we live in a city where people are living below or on the poverty, most people. So I think there needs to be a lot more active participation of the rest of the citizenry in conscientizing and raising awareness around this language.
I dream of a city whose values are defined by quality as opposed to quantity. And I dream of a city where we become an example to others and ourselves about how we interact, how we deal with resource scarceness. But I also dream of a city which inspires people.
I dream of a city where there are a city of role models.
No, I think my dream is for a city that is as complicated as it is today and as impenetrable and impossible to understand, because that in itself is interesting, but that is much more equal.
Very simple. I dream of a city with less fear and more hope.
I dream of an open city where we are all open to each other, and we are open to the continent, and we are open to the world, and where we can each of us speak 5 different languages.
I dream of a city where every child has an inspiring future and can grow in safety and in community.
I think my dream would be that there were more places of engagement, places of interaction, of spaces that differences can become meaningful rather than sources of division.